And we're off. Anyway, we're on the home stretch. This is Kentucky Derby season, so I guess I should use that terminology. Um, we missed one class last week, and I appreciate your patience and understanding. I had to attend a funeral out of state, in fact, in North Carolina, and it was just not possible for me to get back in time to do the class. Now, on one level, you might say, wow, this was a really important class. Any class that covers Israel and the Holocaust, you'd think, wow, this is very important. And I agree, and that's why it's in the curriculum to begin with. But it's also in some ways a symbolic session. What I mean by that is it's very important for it to be there, because I've been saying from the very start that Judaism is a religion, in a sense, but it is also a people. The Jewish people are very much a part of what we call the Jewish religion. And unlike other faiths, traditions, religions, we can't distinguish and separate the two. The very first class, you might remember, I talked about how the three terms that are used most prevalently for Jews and for Judaism would be Yisrael, Israel. We see that in the Bible. Yehuda or Yehudi, Jews, and we definitely see that, and we also see Ivri, the Hebrew, the one Abraham was a Hebrew who crossed over, and that for each of those three you have meanings that are spiritual or somewhat, I guess, abstract, we might say. Israel, the literal meaning of the word, is one who struggles with God. So it brings to mind a very Jewish idea and a very Jewish value of asking questions, of struggling with God. At the same time, Israel is a people, the people of Israel, the children of Israel, Jacob's extended family, and then beyond. And Israel is, of course, a land and now even a state. So all of that, you have the more general meaning, the more spiritual side, the religious side, and you have the peoplehood side. And we have universal meanings to all of these things, to so much within Judaism, and universal interpretations that apply to the whole world. We want to love the stranger everywhere, not just because we were strangers, but in part because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that the two are interconnected. So to talk about being a Jew and the meaning of being a Jew without talking about Jewish peoplehood, in my mind, is a fool's errand. And it needed to be discussed. And the most important events in Jewish history, if you go through the half dozen most important events in Jewish history, two of them occurred roughly within the lifetime of our parents, if not our own, and that is the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. That's 1/3 of the 6 most important events in Jewish history. What are the others? You can go back and forth and argue, but I would say the Exodus, and you can sort of include the 10 Commandments with that, the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the expulsion from Spain. You can make a lot of the Talmud. I mean, you can make some claims for lots of things, but the Holocaust in Israel have to be there. So it definitely needed to be in the curriculum, and discussing the deeper meaning of these two events needed to be in the curriculum. But these are also two events that are so widely covered in classes, including ones we've had, and through the media, that, and even the material I distributed, I sent you links, that it didn't, if there was one class we could sort of do without, or at least skip over for now, that was the one. And I do want to say, especially with Holocaust, the series that was on PBS last fall, I believe, was so superb. It focused on the American experience and the Holocaust, and American Jewry in particular, but it was very good. And so there are lots of things that you can do to sort of brush up, and we may come back to it, but there are other things that are less frequently covered, less known, and Kashrut is one of them. And I definitely want to spend the rest of this hour now talking about Jewish food values. I say that, you know, I could have said this is a session on Kashrut, and most of it will really focus on the kosher laws, but it goes far beyond, you know, whether you can have a cheeseburger. The cheeseburger is there, but the value system behind it is really what I want to discuss. And that goes into other matters, not just foods that you eat, but what you do before you eat, like say a blessing, and how the foods you eat can alter one's behavior, can modify one's behavior, can influence one's behavior in a positive way. Jewish values having to do with food are very, very important. As we say, noshing is sacred. Sorry. But I will say that culture, and this isn't just a Jewish thing, is communicated best and most often through the stomach. Not through the mind, not through the mouth, and except when you're eating, not through prayer, not through study, not through going out into the woods and seeking God. Culture is communicated, and religion, because it's part of culture, at the dinner table. And it has to do with the food you eat, how you eat it, and the people you're eating it with. So all of those things come into play when we're talking about kashrut. You know, at times I've discussed sort of the misogyny of traditional Judaism, of rabbinic Judaism, and I think it is there. But I also think that the rabbis very seriously felt that the home was where the action is when it came to promoting and propagating Judaism and the Jewish people. Remember, they lived primarily after the destruction of the temple in the year 70. The Romans destroyed it. And at that point, the table at home replaced the sacrificial altar. It became, I've used this expression before, but it's important to reiterate, a mikdash ma'at, a microcosm, a smaller version of the temple in Jerusalem. And so every meal then became a time to replicate what was done in the sacrifices, the most important religious work that was done, the most important aspects of the cult. And the woman has a central role in the rabbinic mindset in the home. So it's not as if, you know, this misogyny should be taken to an extreme. In other ways, maybe, yes, I will not deny it. But in terms of the idea of a woman's place is in the kitchen, well, maybe that was the case for the rabbis, but that was the most exalted place. And it's easy for me to say, yes, I know. But let me just put that out there. So what I want to do is talk about the what's, the how's, and the why's. So, and I'm talking specifically about kosher, kashrut, the kosher laws, the kosher values, the kosher principles. But as I said, it'll go beyond that too. So we'll get into the what's, but first I want to get into the definition of what is kosher. And you know, of course, as we've said throughout this class, if you want to share a question or whatever, please put it into the chat. I'll be happy to stop and answer at any time. If you're going to ask whether grasshoppers are kosher, I'll tell you. Yeah, they are. But I mean, if we're going to get into the minutia, we should wait until we sort of take it in its course. But I'd be happy to talk about some of those things too. All right. So kosher means fit. I mean, I really should have said kosher means kosher because it's become an English word. You know, we say something is kosher. We're not usually talking about food. In fact, you know, we're saying this doesn't seem kosher to me. You often hear that in a trial or, you know, in some investigation, you're looking at someone's misbehavior. It doesn't seem quite kosher. It doesn't seem quite right. That's exactly what kosher means. It means fit. It means right. It is on a food sense. In a food sense, it is the good housekeeping seal for food. It means it's fit, it's right, it should, you know, it's good to be eaten. It's good to be eaten. And it's such a powerful, powerful brand of this, when it has to do with food. If we say it's kosher, think of the commercials. We answer to a higher authority. I mean, some of you can remember those. Whether it was for Levi's bread or the hot dogs, the idea of kosher was a very desirable thing. And that is why, and I'm not going to talk about this the whole time, but some of you might have been here long enough to know that, back in the late 90s, I wrote an article about Oreo cookies becoming kosher. That became sort of a thing in the Jewish world, in the New York Times. And the reason Oreos became kosher was not because there were a couple of million Jews in the United States, 3-4 million out of 200 million plus Americans. That would not have made financial sense, economic sense for Nabisco to make Oreos kosher. The reason they were made kosher, you can add Muslims too, because there are definite parallels, connections with halal and kashrut. But it's because of the branding. It's because Americans looked at kosher and said, this stuff is good. And at a time, and that was then, and it's the same now, where there is a lot of mistrust of government agencies, especially those regarding food. And there were a lot of problems in slaughterhouses, for instance, in food preparation. I mean, we see, with chickens especially, but with all kinds of meat production and other, there's just a lot of concern about whether this food is prepared in a humane way and whether the food is actually healthy, whether it's right. So the kosher brand said, it's good, it's okay, it's fit. Funny thing is, there's only one group that didn't buy into that: the Jews. Because at the time when American culture was saying kosher is good, Jews primarily were sort of moving away from a kosher lifestyle. I mean, and part of that is just pure assimilation. Part of it is just that almost every funeral I do, someone's talking about how much the deceased loved lobster. I don't know. I deal with it. But, it's just part of being American. Jews have moved away from kashrut, and yet America has moved toward it for different reasons. Also, I think we know too much. We've been to some of these rather not too clean looking kosher delis and restaurants and said, no, this is not a good housekeeping seal here. It needs to be better cleaned up. I don't know. But anyway, that's a paradox that, that we can get into. But on the, at least in terms of the definition, the word kosher means fit. Okay, so let's move on. Of course, I have to prepare. Hold on one second. Okay. We're good. So, as you can see here, it means fit. I'm trying to make it, I think you can see it. All right. So these are some of the things. That's sort of the what. We're going to get into the what's still. But I want to give you an overview of some of the areas that I want to cover as to why kosher is so important. How it changes our relationship to food. And this is all built into our tradition. None of this is new. This is all sort of part of this eco-kashrut universe that Jews have built. This is why the food part of being Jewish is so important. And I have to tell you, unfortunately, it's the part that, because of assimilation, it's the hardest to talk about. I'm not going to get up there on the high holidays and, lecture the congregation, you guys should be keeping kosher more. It's not going to really be a fruitful conversation. I can talk about why kosher is so important, and I do, and just as I talk about being a vegetarian is for me, and they're related, but it's not the kind of thing you can sell in the same way that even Shabbat and holiday observance, even if people aren't perfectly observant on Shabbat, there's a lot less guilt involved when it comes to those things than kashrut. I'm going to give you an example. I'll get back to that. There's a a story about, this guy goes into a restaurant and he orders a suckling pig. And the most gorgeous, beautiful, huge suckling pig comes out on a platter with an apple in its mouth. And then his rabbi walks in. I guess I probably should say the rabbi walks by, looks in the window, and sees him. Why would the rabbi walk in there? But anyway, let's, goes without saying. Rabbi walks in, and so the guy looks up, looks down, looks up, looks down, and looks at the rabbi and says, I can't understand it. This whole mitzvah, this whole production, all for an apple. Bum. Anyway, it sounded better when I think Jackie Mason said it. But there's a lot of ambivalence about kashrut, and a lot of guilt goes into it. And I sort of want to get beyond that, because I think we've gotten to the point where most American Jews are as assimilated as they're going to get. They are, and I think they're looking for a way back, or at least a way to appreciate and understand the importance of some of these things. And this concept is a biggie. So the things that we'll cover: mindfulness, self-control, body image, we'll touch on a little, kindness, reverence for life, and some of the symbolism involved. And then back to that whole notion of Jewish peoplehood, which all come into play with the kashrut concept. Now let's get to the what's. All right, so there are 3 areas of kashrut. This is the what. And by the way, the terminology here on the top: kosher, permitted; treif, not permitted. Everything I'm going to show you tonight, pretty much, except for that last sheet that I showed you, is in the 2 packets that were linked to the email announcement that I sent out a couple of days ago, and also in my Shabbatogram this week. So today. So you can find all this stuff. So you don't need to be like taking pictures and screenshots and all that. You'll find it. Anyway, so let's talk about 3 elements: classification, preparation, and separation. That should be pretty easy to remember. So first, we're going to talk about classification. What is kosher? Okay. All fruits and vegetables and grains are kosher. Now, Passover, we know, is a whole category unto itself. But everything else, yes. Milk products from kosher animals are kosher as long as it has not come into contact with a meat product. So basically, vegetables, dairy, they all sort of pass the test right away. Now, yes, from kosher animals, some Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox in some cases, go beyond that to say that the milk has to be prepared in a very special, watched way, that and by Jews entirely from beginning to end, which they call Chalav Yisrael. You'll see that labeling on packages on milk sometimes. And if you have an Orthodox relative, which of course is always a dilemma as to how to feed someone who keeps really kosher, that's what they may not like your Hood's milk from the refrigerator. That needs to be worked out. And while I say that, let's say that every person has a different standard of kosher. Every rabbi has a different standard of kosher. There is no one objective, this is kosher. There are some objectives, this is definitely not kosher, like that ham sandwich. But, okay, birds of prey are not kosher. That's an interesting thing. I'll get back to it. Fish are kosher if they have fins and scales. Mammals, land animals, are kosher if they have split hooves and they chew their cud. So, why? I got, these are the questions you all want to ask. So I'm just like, I'm not going to ask them all. But okay, why are animals that chew the cud and have split hooves kosher while others are not? I'm going to answer it, but you can also put an answer into the chat if you think you have a good answer. There's no one answer to any of these things. If you have an answer that your rabbi told you when you were becoming bar mitzvah or whatever, you just want to share it, go for it. Okay, so the answer is, there is no answer. The Bible the Torah doesn't tell us why. Doesn't say why fish and fowl, some are kosher, some aren't. In fact, the Torah says very, very little. It doesn't say anything about birds of prey. The Talmud does, which is, as we get on into later Jewish conversations and legal discussions, that's when some of these things start to develop. However, I think there is something to be said for these categories that are very instructive. In Hebrew, it's called musar, means moral, ethical lessons. We can learn ethical lessons from Kashrut. Important ones. The lesson that, I don't know who invented the expression, you are what you eat. If someone knows, put it in the chat, please. I don't think it was Arlo Guthrie, but it sounds like something from that generation. The whole Earth catalog. I don't know. You are what you eat. So the rabbis took that very literally. So when they say birds of prey are not kosher, they're not talking P-R-A-Y, they're talking P-R-E-Y. Birds like a vulture. You can't have a vulture sandwich, or a vulture soup with matzo balls. And you think about the difference between a vulture and a chicken, and you can almost implicitly understand what it's getting at. If we eat it, we become like it. So although there's no verifiable scientific data showing that if you eat a vulture, you're going to become a vulture or like a vulture, there's something to be said for identifying with what you're eating. And if you're going to eat a very docile, chickens can have their moments, but some pretty bad, violent moments. But for the most part, they're not predators. And I think that's the key. We don't want to be violent. We don't want to eat violent things. And that goes for birds, but it also goes for the animals that chew their cud and have a split hoof, because those animals tend to be more domestic, or at least less violent. A giraffe, it can fit in this category. So can venison. It's very hard to catch and kill either of those. So we're talking about cows and other fairly harmless livestock. If you're sitting around chewing your cud all day, you don't have time to go attack other animals. And so lions and tigers and bears, oh my, they're not kosher. So I think that we can understand, even if it wasn't the original intent, and we don't know what the original intent was of these laws. They could well have just been anti-pagan, which gets us into peoplehood. That's, we're identifying as Jews because we're different from them. Us, them. Pagans did this, we do that. We don't eat that. It also makes us, and I'm going down sort of the list of these values that I showed you a few moments ago: mindfulness, self-control, not eating everything we see, but having to look at it and say, can I eat that? Having to look at the label when you're in the supermarket, because that's primarily where we get our food, not so much going out and shooting. And by the way, we'll get to it in a second, but the animal has to die painlessly. So you can't just shoot it. You can't just kill it in that form. It has to be killed in a way that is painless. So anyway, and the other thing, fish, fins and scales, it's pretty arbitrary. I think bottom feeders, maybe there is a cleanliness element, that they tend to not be kosher. Shellfish, you can find reasons. So the rabbis came up with those reasons. For instance, for pig, they came up with the midrash that a pig is a very hypocritical animal. Why is it hypocritical? Because what it shows you on the outside is not what it is on the inside. A pig has a split hoof. So it lies around all day and goes, hi, I'm a pig. I have a split hoof. Guess what? I'm kosher. But inside, it does not chew its cud. So therefore, it is not kosher. But we don't know that because we're only looking at the outside. So there's a beautiful lesson about not succumbing to hypocrisy. All these come from our food. They come from what we eat. Now, I will say, that some foods are more kosher and unkosher than others. Not really, actually. I mean, if you're kosher, you're kosher. If you're unkosher, you're unkosher. But with pig and, to a degree, shellfish, that has become sort of the telltale. If we don't, the shorthand for unkosher is pork. We almost don't have to differentiate between the two. Let's see if I can find another question that you might have. Was there a question? I think there was something in the chat. How come I can't get into my chat? Here we go. Okay, since milk comes from the belly of a cow and does come in contact with meat, how is it kosher? Well, great question, Norman or Suzanne. I think it was Norman. So when it's alive, the animal is not meat. In a sense, flesh is dead. That's a really interesting thing. Maybe I'm going to jump ahead because it makes sense too. Separating milk from meat, which is, one of the things, that was the separation. That's the third thing of those three. The idea of separating milk from meat may have to do with a very important Jewish principle of separating death from life. Life is paramount. Life is triumphant. We preserve life at all costs. Saving a life and you save the world. Remember, for Jews, life means after birth. We're not talking about before birth. Milk is, in the belly of the cow before it's dead. So it has no classification yet. The cow doesn't, and neither does the milk until it comes out. Here's an interesting question. What happens if a cow is slaughtered, but its calf is born after the cow is slaughtered? I mean, it's sort of gory to think about this. So this has come up in rabbinical conversations. The calf would technically be part of the dead cow and therefore meat. So every product of that calf, including its milk, would be fleshig. So you could have a cheeseburger with the milk of that calf when it grows into a cow. There you go. Does that ever happen? No. And the fact is, now with all kinds of, we're not getting into bio foods, but the fact that we can now harvest and grow cells, in a lab to create meat, that is actually meat, not to mention the artificial meat that's created and the artificial cheese that's created. We can have every combination imaginable. So it's a little confusing, but the principle of separating life from death is very important in Judaism. And I really think milk is the stuff of life. Meat is dead. Doesn't mean we relegate meat to a lesser place. In fact, for traditional Jews, they celebrate Shabbat, whatever, with meat. But anyway, life and death. So Meryl asked me about mother's milk. Yeah, the mother's milk is kosher. I'm not so sure it's milchiks. I haven't looked that up lately. I don't believe it would be. But anyway, mother isn't. Yeah, for sure. Okay, let me get back. Any other questions? All right. So this is interesting. I don't mind, going a little out of order, but I want to get back here. So this is, and again, this is in your packet, the forbidden species. This is the section of Leviticus where they are listed, especially the mammals and birds. The thing about the birds is that technically one would say that birds that aren't listed here would by default be okay, because it's saying this is what you should not eat. Wait a second. No, you can eat the taher, the clean birds, and not eat the tameh, like the eagle, the vulture, and it goes down, it doesn't mention it specifically as edible or not edible, the turkey, because it didn't exist yet. So there have been a lot of discussions in rabbinical circles, again, whether the turkey should be considered kosher. Some say it looks like a chicken, so it's kosher. The general accepted position is that it is, but it just shows you how confusing this can all get. Okay, let's go to the next level, preparation. So even if it's a kosher animal, an animal that is raised kosher, that is kosher, that, it's one of the list of kosher animals, you still have to kill it in the right way for it to be kosher. So that means it has to be completely healthy. We're looking at number 2 here. The animal is completely healthy and it was slaughtered by someone familiar with Jewish law, most often a rabbi. It was slaughtered with one pass of a flawless knife, jugular vein, dies instantly, no pain, supposedly, and D, all the blood has been removed by draining, salting, soaking. The liver must be broiled because salting and soaking isn't enough. The Torah looks at the blood as symbolic of the soul. Hadam hu hanefesh. The blood is the life stuff. Shedding blood is, of course, the most grievous of sins, murder. And so we don't take shedding blood lightly, I should say. And that's very important. Killing is a concession. Now, I say this, not as a vegetarian, but as a rabbi. I have not been proselytizing vegetarianism all my years here, and it's because I think that is legitimately a choice, but I think it's becoming an increasingly compelling choice for all the reasons that Kashrut is a compelling choice, to respect life and to be very reluctant to kill. So here's an example. Let's see if I don't know if I can make this bigger. A little bigger. After the Baal Shem Tov died, this is a Hasidic story, a new slaughterer took his place. He was well learned in all the laws and followed them scrupulously. He sharpened his knife, knew just where to hold the neck, how to make the cut. He noticed, though, that a man would watch him as he slaughtered the chickens and shake his head in disapproval. After several days, he asked the man what he was doing wrong. I whet the blade, I sharpen it, I make the smallest, quickest cut, just as I learned from the Baal Shem Tov. What am I doing that's upsetting you? The man, who remembered watching the Baal Shem Tov prepare for and slaughter animals, shook his head. It is true, you wet the blade and sharpen it, but when you use water to sharpen your blade, the Baal Shem Tov used his own tears. So there is this feeling that the rabbi or whoever does the ritual slaughtering has to hate his job, has to not stand the sight of blood, really doesn't like it, and certainly isn't out to make an extra buck doing it. The kosher supervision biz has become, in some ways, pretty corrupt. People get a lot of money changes hands. Now that big companies like Nabisco are going all in for Kashrut, and it's a shame. But certainly the killing, certainly the shochet part, needs to be done by someone of extreme humility and reticence to take a life. And you can. So when you open up your kosher chicken McNugget, you know that whoever killed that chicken didn't want to, or didn't like it, didn't enjoy it, and I think that means something, teaching us about the value of life, respecting life. All right, so I already talked a little about milk and meat. There is a chat, though. I never want to go too far ahead of our skis here. Okay. Thank you, Leo. I think I read something about human milk being parv. Thank you. Okay. If it's necessary, like for babies. Yeah, I can't imagine a baby waiting 3 hours, before the Gerber's meat meal. So I should, take this opportunity to talk about that. Let's go back. Everything works out here. Separating milk and meat. So this notion of life and death, I think, is an important element of it. And you can see that it's here as well. But we really don't know. The only thing we do know is that it's mentioned 3 times in the Torah. And what's mentioned in the Torah is not you should not have a cheeseburger. It's said that you shall not seethe or broil a kid, meaning a baby goat. Seethe is a better term, and its mother's milk. Boil, you can say whatever, not broil, but boil. The funny thing is, the word chalav in Hebrew means milk. In the Torah, the vowels aren't there. So the word chelev, which has the same vowels, means fat. And it makes a lot more sense to fry up a baby goat, in its mother's fat than to cook it in its mother's milk. But whatever, this is how it came down to us. It probably has connections to pagan worship or pagan custom. And remember, the Israelites wanted to differentiate themselves at all costs from their pagan neighbors. For one thing, if you're eating different things, you're also eating in different places. And this is a key all throughout. This gets back to the peoplehood element. Peoplehood is horizontal and vertical. Let me come back to you. What I mean by that is horizontal, meaning all over the world. Jews all over the world keep kosher, or at the very least, Jewish food customs are found all over the world. You can go anywhere, Paris, Egypt, China on Passover and find matzah. You can probably find kosher food in almost all of these places too. And you can find some particular Jewish type foods, although remember, Sephardic and Ashkenazic have different customs, but like cholent on Shabbat, which is this slow cooking food specifically for the Sabbath, because you don't need to turn off the flame or turn on the flame. You're not really cooking it. It's sort of pre-cooked, but it's staying warm. So you have foods like that. You have potato latkes. You have, kishka. I'll show you some foods later on. Kishka means intestines, by the way, stuffed. I hear it's delicious. I've never had it. But they have vegetarian kishka, though. So let me get back to this separation. Comes from you shall not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. But look at the top. There's a really famous joke. God says, "Thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk." Moses says, "You mean we should not mix milk and meat?" God says, "Thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk." Moses says, "You mean we should wait 3 hours before meat and milk?" God says, "Thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk." Moses says, "Got it, God. You mean we should have 2 complete sets of dishes?" God says, "Whatever, Moses, have it your way." I love that little joke, and that's why I laughed at it. Anyway, the idea is that these traditions evolved over time. It does not make them less legitimate, but we don't know originally what it was all about. What we do know is that it's gained meaning for us. For one thing, it teaches discipline. For another, the respect of life and death and that separation that I talked about. And for another, it's you are what you eat, once again. So we think about the inner meaning, this significance, the spirituality of milk and meat. But it keeps Jews a little bit different. It means we have to think about what we're eating before we sit down to the meal. It means we're probably a little less reluctant to just, to live in Jewish communities, to frequent Jewish restaurants, to have Jewish friends. It doesn't mean you can't have non-Jewish friends, and certainly in our day and age, that's the case. But think about our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents' generation. These laws kept the Jews together. And so I'm going back now. I said this was horizontal, Jews all over the world, but it's also vertical. These are the foods, the separated milk and meat foods that my grandmother made. that my grandmother's grandmother made, my grandmother's grandfather might have made too, I would hope. All of these things, tie the Jewish people together. They give us a continuity that extends beyond the wonderful literature that we've built and created. And that's why I say culture transmits through the stomach. All right. So let me go on to mindfulness. The Jewish food values, and not just kashrut, but Jewish values teach mindfulness. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is an interesting story by Nigel Savage, who was the founder of the group Chazon, Vision, which is a Jewish eco and food oriented organization that has done some amazing work. So he was teaching about Tu B'Shvat to a number of people, and they were talking about food being stolen from God. What does that mean exactly? He said to the man in the front of the room, "What was the last thing you had before you came here?" He said, "An apple." "Great," I said, "an apple. Did you steal the apple?" "No," he replied, "I bought it at ShopRite." People smiled, but he was quite right. When most of us want an apple, we go to a store and we buy one. With stores and markets as the intermediating mechanism by which we obtain our food, which necessarily involve our not stealing, what could this text possibly imply? And how can a bracha make a difference? The text, by the way, is in the prior page, and it says that if you don't say a blessing, it's like you're stealing from God. So, okay. I said, "Sir, if someone had given you $1 million, would you have been able to make that apple?" People smiled again, this time with a different sense of awareness. The point of "the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof" is to remind us that we enjoy the natural fruits of creation. We ourselves did not create and could never create them. A bracha is different. A blessing is different than saying "thanks for dinner, Mom." But we should say that too. When the rabbis of the Talmud suggested not merely that we say a bracha before eating, but that failing to do so represented a case of theft, this is a central idea. They teach us we might buy an apple or we might grow it, but we can never create it, and its creation is an everyday miracle. Mindfulness is such a key factor in how Jews eat, and that begins with the notion of saying a blessing. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel called it radical amazement. You don't need to see the Red Sea split or even a rainbow to feel that radical amazement. You just need to look at your food and say for a second, how did this food get here? How is it possible that, all of the steps fell into place for me to have this food in front of me and to stop and bless? And the blessing doesn't need to be Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, the prayer we often say for a full meal and for bread, but it can just be, oh my God, this is an amazing thing that I'm about to do. I'm about to eat, which is going to sustain my body, which is going to keep me healthy, which is going to keep me alive. That's part of eating too. That has nothing to do specifically with whether it's ham on rye. So here are the blessings. I know this is small. You'll be able to see it in the packet. Anyway, there are specific blessings for different kinds of food. The bread one is overarching because bread was considered sort of the staff of life, and the ingredient found at every meal, certainly every sacred meal. We think of challah, but if there's no bread, it's okay. You're gonna have a cookie. You say "Borei minei mezonot." Having wine, Borei pri hagafen, has nothing to do with kiddush all the time. It's just you're having wine or grape juice. Fruit from a tree, Borei pri ha'etz. And of course, each of those blessings begins with the formula Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe. And then it goes into the third person, creator of whatever, Borei pri hagafen, the one who creates. The second person, the first person plural, the third person, there's a timelessness that sort of dissolves in this very simple blessing. So blessings, an important thing, important element here. There's also an ethical side to eating. And this famous story of Choni, the circle drawer, talks about that. And I'm not going to read the whole story, but basically he slept for 70 years and he saw men planting the carob tree when he woke up. And he said, how long does it take for the tree to bear fruit? 70 years. And then he asked him, are you certain you'll live another 70 years? He replied, I found an already grown carob tree in the world as my ancestors planted it there for me, so I too plant this for my children. So we have this notion of taking responsibility for the feeding of subsequent generations, which both means treating the earth in such a way that it will be around. The quote on the bottom, we do not inherit the earth from our parents, we borrow it from our children, but also feeding the hungry, feeding others. So there's a double-barreled mitzvah here of environmentalism and helping to, feed the hungry. Of course, both are very important to the Jewish value system, and both are centered in the production and the consumption of food. I'm going to cover very briefly some of these other things. Yes, there's a discipline aspect to eating, and Jewish sources talk about this too. You can look at this on your own, but this whole notion of eating in moderation, for instance, here it is, Rambam, Maimonides, was Mr. Moderation. He's, he totally believed in that. By the way, when you say a blessing, you're going to be eating in moderation because you're not chowing down before you've even had a chance to let everyone else sit down around you. You're eating slowly. Slow eating is a good thing. So here is what Rambam said. In my opinion, kadosh, to be holy, is not from forbidden relationships, but is the kind of separation mentioned throughout the Torah when it comes to being elevated. For the Torah warned us regarding forbidden relationships, forbidden foods, etc., etc. Kosher meat and wine, was an important element here. Accordingly, a person with strong physical desires could behave promiscuously, with one spouse, or whatever, and eat kosher meat and drink wine in a disgusting manner. That's the point I'm getting at, since the Torah had not forbidden it outright, and he would be minuval breshut haTorah, a scoundrel with the permission of Torah. Therefore, after the Torah specified what is certainly forbidden, it returns to tell us that we should also limit that which is permissible. Basically, he's saying, eat in a civilized manner. Okay, and then you get into the question of vegetarian, eating meat, and so you can look at some of that stuff too. I had mentioned at the beginning that there are certain Jewish ethnic foods, such as latkes, matzah, kasha varnishkas. If you don't know what it is, then you never ate it. This is a little known delicacy. I happen to love it. It has nothing to do with varnish, basically a mixture of buckwheat and bow tie macaroni. Why a bow tie? Many sages discussed this and agreed that some Jewish mother decided that you can't come to the table without a tie. Okay, very good. I mentioned kishka before. Vegetarian kishka is pretty good, I have to say. You stuff it with carrots, celery, onions, flour, and spices. Kreplach, dumplings, pierogies by another name. Cholent, I mentioned that for Shabbat. Gefilte fish. How could we have a session on Jewish food and not mention gefilte fish? A few years ago, I had problems with my filter and my fish pond. Oh, this is not even funny. Today usually comprises small fish balls eaten with horseradish, chrein, which is judged in its relative strength, bringing tears to your eyes at 100 paces. And then bagels. I mean, you have to talk bagels. these aren't really the best of Jewish foods. I wouldn't want to be known for this stuff. There's better Jewish food out there now. But back in ancient Israel, they basically just had bread, oil, wine, and vegetables. So I am going to now look in the chat. AJ Jacobs, yes, he did. I have seen that book. Thanks 1,000, where he undertook to thank every person who had a role. It was a very Jewish thing. But he also had the year of living biblically, which took each of the mitzvot, basically, and tried to live it each day. Of course, half of them relate to the land of Israel or to things that we no longer do, like sacrifices. But he's an interesting guy. So the tradition, we are called upon to say 100 blessings every day. Now, if you go to Morning Minyan, which doesn't happen all the time, you're already like a third of the way there by the end of the morning service. Because even like the first prayers, those Baruch Atah Adonai, those special blessings, that get you a lot of the way there. But the idea is they should be spontaneous. And, just for being all together, I mean, there's a blessing for studying Torah, which we haven't been doing and probably should. But it starts with food. It only starts with food, and it expands to all of life. Okay, and that's a good, thing for me to cover. It was in the opening sheet. I talked about reverence for life, kindness to animals, no small thing, which I think we think of animals in our tradition as training wheels. We're using them in a way, but the ends are also the means. We should be kind. We should feed our animal before we feed ourselves. If we're kind to animals, if we don't kill them needlessly or painfully, we'll hopefully be kinder to people. So that is the symbolism there. So that's most of what I wanted to cover, but I do have something else I could do. But does anyone have a question? I wanted to sort of give you the basic background. The one thing I didn't cover in any real detail is the kosher symbols, the OU, the OK, Kaf K, things like that. And there's a new video that just came out by the Hartman Institute. We've done a lot of their stuff. This is an 8-minute video. It's not long. We're starting 5 minutes before 8, so it'll just extend a little bit after 8. But I want to show it to you because I think it will help to sum up what we've learned today in a really nice way. Oops. Sorry. Here we go.
Jews have a special connection to American society, but explaining what that connection is can sometimes be a little bit tricky. We could talk about American Jewish literature, or we could talk about American Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, or assimilation trends, or you could talk about general success in the arts and the sciences and in politics. But there's one doorway into American Judaism that I am particularly partial to, and that's food. Let's talk about what American Jews eat. Go into any supermarket today and look at the packaging of your average product. What do you see? You're likely going to find a barrage of labels and symbols. USDA, vegan, non-GMO, whatever. But then there's this one. It's a U inside of a circle. It's called an OU. An OU means a food is kosher and has been certified by the Orthodox Union, a Jewish communal organization which happens to be the largest certifier of kosher products in the world. In the US, kosher certification is big business. Somewhere between 25 and 40% of foods in a typical supermarket have some form of kosher certification, and more foods are certified as kosher than organic or premium. And kosher certification paved the way for all the other kinds of certification that you see on American foods. Kosher certification may seem like an obvious thing to do, but it actually wasn't always this way. In fact, it's really a deeply American idea, one developed long before the FDA made food safety standards, and one that flourished here in the way that it hasn't in basically any other country. So Why did thousands of American companies voluntarily put a private Jewish company's stamp of approval on their packaging? It turns out the answer can tell us a lot about how Jews became and remain American consumers. First, let's talk about what makes something kosher or not in the first place. It's actually a lot of things. There are foods that are just off limits entirely, like pork and shellfish, which you're not supposed to eat at all. Then, there are foods like chicken and milk, which are fine to eat on their own, but prohibited if you cook them together. There's also a few special foods, like meat and wine, which require a Jewish person to be involved at some point in the preparation process itself. Now, figuring out whether a food is kosher isn't always so difficult. Unprocessed foods, like fruits and grains, are almost always fine. And if the food you buy is prepared locally, then trusting that the food is kosher basically just comes down to trusting your local kosher butcher or baker or whoever. But when supply chains get longer, things get a lot more complicated. Let's take, for example, cheese. Just looking at the final product doesn't give you the full picture as to whether it's kosher, because something problematic could have happened in the production process and you just never know. Back in the day, cheese also traveled better than other foods, so a person who wanted to eat it might just have no idea who the cheesemaker was or whether they could be trusted. Because of these complications, some of the earliest kosher certifications we have are for cheese. This one, from the Cairo Geniza in Egypt, is 800 years old. And if you look carefully, you can see the word kosher right over here. In the 20th century, the complications of the cheese process basically become the default. And because of that, keeping kosher gets a lot more difficult. Grocery stores, as well as the new supermarkets, line their shelves with processed foods made in giant factories. And for Jewish consumers, those were basically black boxes. To combat this, Orthodox Jews, and particularly Orthodox Jewish women, began campaigning for better information. They wanted to know, for example, whether it was okay to buy a cake mix, or a can of beans, or a sleeve of crackers. And they pressed their communal organizations to figure out ways to solve this problem. In other words, to let them be mainstream American consumers. And the solution they chose was a pretty radical one. In 1924, the Orthodox Union hatched a plan. They would send people into factories all around the country to inspect facilities where food was made and prepared. Then, they would report back to their communities to determine which products could be eaten. The goal wasn't simply to create a big list of foods that were kosher that Jews could reference every time they went to the grocery store. Instead, the OU envisioned a world where observant Jews could do what everyone else did: to go into a store, to inspect whatever products were there, and decide on the spot what to buy without having to consult external sources of information. It was a bold vision. In order for it to work, the OU needed buy-in from major brands. The first big company to take up the idea was Heinz, which was known at the time more for its pickles than for its ketchup. Heinz was willing to put a mark on their packaging, knowing this would sway a large market of Jewish consumers towards their brand and away from competitors. But at the same time, they felt marking their products with a Jewish symbol, like say a Hebrew letter, would alienate their non-Jewish customers. To solve for this, Heinz, with the help of a promotional agency, designed a new symbol, the letter U inside a circle. This would serve as a simple, clear indicator that a food was kosher, while at once being invisible to consumers not in the know. And the strategy worked. A few years later, 26 of Heinz's 57 varieties wore the symbol. In the decade that followed, many other companies adopted kosher labeling too. Certification, it turns out, was a win-win for consumers and manufacturers. Kosher-keeping Jews got access to new products, and kosher makers got access to a new customer base. Today, there are hundreds of kosher certifiers. And because so many products are certified, companies that want to get certification often find that all the hard work has been done for them because their suppliers are already labeled as kosher. This powerful network effect says a lot about the massive success of private kosher certification. I find this story fascinating because none of it was inevitable. The OU could have certified foods made by major American food producers, but just kept the information in a public list. And Jewish consumers could have used that list to inform their shopping, which is how things are still done in Europe. Jewish consumers also could have just turned to companies owned by conscientious Jews, like Manischewitz. But American Jewish consumers just weren't interested in any of these options. They wanted to judge what to buy at the supermarket just by looking at the label, just like everybody else. They wanted their traditions to be compatible with mainstream American culture and not force them out of it. American Jews often question just how visible their religious identity should be, about whether they should push for Hanukkah menorahs next to Christmas trees, or how liberalism and Zionism should interact, or how to think about anti-Semitism in America. But American identity in particular is shaped by the products that people buy. In the 90s, when Nabisco swapped the lard in its Oreo cookies for vegetable shortening so that they could make their cookies kosher, Rabbi Joshua Hammerman wrote in the New York Times, only half-jokingly, that it was a sign that Jews have finally made it. The story of the kosher symbol, then, is really a kind of microcosm for American Judaism overall. To be an American, to buy as an American, but to nonetheless remain distinctly Jewish. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel. Also,
Okay.
we have all sorts of content that's
Hold
not in
on.
video form, including podcasts, lectures, possibly events in your area. So if you want to keep up with
Yeah, I'm shameless. Oops. Shameless promotion. All right. So, any questions? Let me see what we got there. Suzanne, you asked about the milk. That was before. Okay. I think we have nothing new. So you can unmute yourselves. Was there something that you learned from that video, or just in general that surprised you? By the way, here's a list. I can show it to you of some of the more popular kosher symbols. I know it's hard to see, but anyway, there are so many of them. And I think the thing that needs to be known is that every rabbi has a slightly different approach, and one person's kosher is not another's. And there are all kinds of categories. I want to actually mention one that's very popular, and you should know about it. It's called glatt. You hear the word glatt kosher. Glatt means smooth, and it has to do with the lungs. Now, the lungs are inspected whenever an animal is killed because there could be blemishes, there could be injuries, there could any kind of wound, or certainly if it had been in a fight or whatever, would render it unkosher. So it's especially important that the lungs be smooth. However, if an animal is checked for kashrut, they check for that. So the idea that something is glatt kosher, it's extra checked, but it's already kosher. And there's really no reason to insist on something being glatt kosher. So here's the thing. If someone offers you a glatt kosher slice of pizza, you can ask where its lungs are, because there's nothing about pizza that can conceivably be or not be glatt. And it's become sort of almost, it's overdone as part of the industry, that people are thinking that means very kosher. And it's not necessarily very kosher. The other thing I want to mention that is confusing has to do with cheese. Wine also, there are differences between the conservative movement's approach, which goes back decades, and orthodoxy, especially regarding cheese. There are chemical reactions that happen within the cheese production process that could involve a catalyst that comes from an animal. However, the chemical breaks down, it's complicated. Basically, it is not in its original form, and the conservative movement has okayed the use of cheese that doesn't have kosher certification. So you'll see now, many conservative synagogues will go the extra step to have only kosher cheese, but we, in fact, depending on our caterers, would not insist on it. So that is, an important distinction. The thing with wine has to do with it being used for ritual purposes, non-Jewish ritual purposes, and the production by Jews. But if wine is being used just for dinner, as opposed to for kiddush, the conservative movement has been much more lenient about that too. But those are just two little, side issues of this extraordinarily complex topic.
Rabbi,
So are there any? Yes, go ahead, Norman.
There was a recent Pew poll that said 70% of Jewish marriages are with non-Jews. And the assimilation there, I was wondering if that was the reason so many Jews are moving away from Kashrut.
Well, and I think it's really fitting in America. It was not convenient. It's become more so in the New York area for sure. We have 3 restaurants in Stamford. We have options. New Haven has several restaurants I know now. New York, of course, has one every corner. So it's not like you can't eat out if you only eat kosher. But for the most part, you go west of the Hudson, that's not going to be the case. And so people want to live a life. They want to fit in. It's just like people drive on Shabbat. They moved out to the suburbs. They're not in walking communities. So Kashrut was one of the things to go pretty quickly. It also actually, in the Reform movement, was a symbol of rebellion against what they considered to be oppressive tradition. The Reform movement saw itself as not ritualistic, but focusing on the ethics of the prophets, the universal ethics. So the Reform movement famously came into being in the late 19th century at a convention in Pittsburgh that featured what is known as the Treifa banquet. Treif meaning not kosher, and every item on the menu was not kosher. And that's very typical. I think you find now with the Reform movement, they're moving back a little bit toward kosher. But I know locally, if you go to any of the synagogues, you can get kosher food catered, but their kitchens aren't kosher. So, I think kashrut is definitely something that's become part of the focus of us on assimilation for so many Jews. Meryl, I saw you pop into the picture. Did you want to say anything?
I was just thinking that in the Reform synagogues, temples that I have belonged to, there is at least an effort when there's was a congregational dinner or something, at least not to necessarily have meat and milk at the same meal, the same table, something to at least, I would say, I recognize it exists.
It's kosher style, which you often see. You'll see people wanting to, especially with kosher relatives or friends, okay, we won't serve ham. We won't serve the shellfish, at this wedding. So it'll be kosher style, but it's not as if it'll be supervised that the animals were killed in a kosher way or anything like that. So, one could be strict about it and say, you can't be a little bit pregnant. You can't be a little bit kosher. Either you're kosher or you're not. That's true, but I do think it's sometimes a very nice thing to make a concession to a relative, even if one does not keep kosher in his own or her own or their own personal lives, to extend and try to have kosher style. Rabbi Harold Kushner, who died a couple of weeks ago, used to tell a story about that at a rabbinical conference with a Reform colleague, he would take out his ham sandwich and say hamotzi. That's like the old kosher pig, literally. And some of the conservative or more traditional rabbis would scoff at that, like it's hypocritical. Getting back to the pig, remember, the sign of the hypocrite. But in fact, Kushner thought it was admirable that, even if it's not kosher food, to promulgate that Jewish value of saying the blessing, of appreciating the food, of seeing it as a gift from God, is in and of itself a good thing. Ronnie?
I just was saying, I remember your sermon on the kosher pig. That was one of our, that and Lashon Hara made a big impact on our family.
Okay.
Though it wasn't hard. It was very hard not to talk about people after a Passover Seder and people left.
Right.
But I do remember.
Gossip and hypocrisy. Those are the big two. I'm all for hypocrisy, I have to tell you. I think it's, it gets a bad rap because to be a hypocrite means you have to have a high standard that you're not meeting. Someone who's a mass murderer has a very low standard of behavior that he's meeting quite well. So I totally for a little bit hypocrisy.
We don't call it lashon hara. We call it character analysis when we must.
You call it pillow talk, and and it's okay within the confines of your house.
Yes.
So there was another story that what was it? Well, it was at another rabbinical conference, actually one I was at, and it was with the Reform movement, and I do a lot with the Reform movement. I loved it, and it was just sort of a slip of the tongue, but nothing was kosher, and that surprised me because I hadn't been to one of these before, and someone spoke, a really famous Reform rabbi whose name I will not mention. Was a slip of the tongue, but someone, he said he was a little nervous when he was a young rabbi, whatever. Someone asked him, what is kashrut? And of course, he related to it in the way he could. He said, it's the ritual slaughter of Orthodox Jews. What he meant was that Orthodox Jews are the ones who keep kosher because he doesn't. But it did not come out right. The problem in my mind was that everyone laughed. And I had that problem watching CNN last night too. But anyway, I'm not going to go there. So I guess we can learn a lot from our kosher laws. Does anyone have any other questions?
I had a question. What's the kosher situation in Israel?
That's a really good question. It's government controlled because the ultra-Orthodox parties control the government, but they have different views. There's Sephardic and there's Ashkenazic. So there are different kashrut supervisions, and Chabad has its own standards. So there's a government authorization, but there are also local rabbis who authorize, and one of the important issues is what constitutes kashrut. So it goes beyond whether your food is kosher and prepared in a kosher way. You also can't be open on Shabbat, which to some extent I understand, although it has nothing to do with the kosher quality of the food, but it's part of the standard. They want to be able to say to an observant Jew, this is a place that keeps an observant style. But then you can't have New Year's Eve parties because there are some ultra-Orthodox Jews who feel that is actually a holiday remembering a saint, Sebastian or whatever they call it. It gets to be very messy. And of course, lots of underhanded stuff going on. So like everywhere, there's corruption and, with kashrut, and I think needs to be addressed. All right, well, thank you all for joining in tonight. We are moving along through the curriculum. We are not going to backtrack to Israel and Holocaust unless there are ways I might be able to fit it into the last session, but I do recommend you look at all the information I sent out and also this information, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you all. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.